My name is Sora Marie Whitaker, and I'm 68 years old. I've lived in this small, creaking house on Maple Street for 47 years, raised a son here, buried a husband here, and thought I'd die here, wrapped in the warmth of family. But 3 months ago, my only child, Thomas, stood in my kitchen. My kitchen with its chipped blue tiles and the coffee pot I've used since he was a boy, and told me, "You're just waiting to die anyway, Mom. It's time you moved on." His wife, Laura, stood behind him, arms crossed her lips, pressed tight like she was swallowing something sour. They wanted the house. They wanted me gone. And in that moment, I felt my heart crack. Not like glass, but like an old tree, splitting slow and deep, the kind of wound that doesn't bleed but changes you forever. I raised Thomas alone after my husband George passed. George was a carpenter, a quiet man with hands that could build anything cribs, tables, dreams. When he died, Thomas was just 12, all lanky limbs, and a temper that flared like dry kindling. I worked 2 jobs, mornings at the library, evenings at the diner, to keep us afloat. I mended his jeans, packed his lunches, cheered at his baseball games, even when my feet ached from standing all day. I thought I was building something unbreakable, a bond that would outlast me. But somewhere along the way, Thomas changed. Or maybe I just stopped seeing him clearly, blinded by a mother's love. He married Laura 10 years ago, a woman with sharp eyes and a smile that never reached them. At first, I tried to love her, tried to see her as the daughter I never had. I'd bake her favorite lemon bars, invite her to Sunday dinners, ask about her work at the real estate office. But Laura had a way of making me feel small, like I was an old piece of furniture cluttering up her life. "Sora, you shouldn't be lifting those heavy pans at your age," she'd say, her voice dripping with concern that felt more like a jab. Thomas never corrected her. He'd just sit there scrolling on his phone, letting her words chip away at me. The house became their battleground. It's not much to look at: 2 bedrooms, a sagging porch, a backyard where Thomas used to chase fireflies, but it's paid for every cent of it with George's savings and my sweat. After George died, I kept it up painting the walls, fixing the leaky faucet, planting roses along the fence. It was my sanctuary, my proof that I could hold things together. Thomas and Laura saw it differently. To them, it was a gold mine, a plot of land in a neighborhood that's suddenly up and coming. They started dropping hints about selling it, about how I'd be more comfortable in a senior apartment. I'd laugh it off, thinking they couldn't mean it. This was my home. Their home, too, once. But that day in the kitchen, there was no laughter. Thomas's words hit me like a slap. "You're just waiting to die anyway." I can still see his face, not angry, but impatient, like I was a chore he wanted to cross off his list. Laura didn't speak, but her silence was louder than words. I stood there, gripping the edge of the counter, the same counter where I'd rolled out dough for Christmas cookies, where I'd bandaged Thomas's scraped knees. I wanted to scream, to ask how he could say that to me, his mother, the woman who'd given him everything. But my voice wouldn't come. It was trapped somewhere deep, tangled in years of keeping quiet to keep the peace. I don't remember what I said next. Something about needing time to think. They left their car peeling out of the driveway like they couldn't get away fast enough. I sank into a chair, the house so quiet I could hear the clock ticking in the hall. That clock was George's, an old brass thing he'd wind every Sunday. It was still ticking, but I felt like time had stopped for me. I was 68, not ancient, but in their eyes I was already gone, a ghost haunting a house they wanted to claim. For days I didn't leave the house. I'd sit by the window watching the roses sway in the breeze, wondering where I'd gone wrong. Had I loved Thomas too much? Not enough. Had I failed to teach him gratitude? I'd always thought being a mother meant giving everything: your time, your dreams, your heart. But what happens when the ones you gave it all to turn their backs? I felt like a fool, an old woman clinging to a life that no longer wanted her. The nights were the worst. I'd lie awake replaying Thomas's words, each one a needle in my chest. I'd think of George, how he'd hold my hand and say, "Sora, you're stronger than you know." But I didn't feel strong. I felt discarded like a worn-out dress tossed in the back of a closet. I stopped answering the phone when Laura called her messages all fake cheer, asking if I'd thought about our talk. I didn't want to hear her voice, didn't want to face the truth that my son, my boy, had chosen her side over mine. One morning, I forced myself to get up. I made coffee the same way I always did, 2 scoops in the old percolator. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the chair where Thomas used to do his homework, his pencils scratching across paper. I could almost see him there, his brow furrowed, asking me to check his math. That boy was gone, replaced by a man I didn't recognize. And yet I couldn't stop loving him even as my heart broke. I decided to walk to the corner store, something I hadn't done in weeks. The air was crisp, the kind of autumn morning that smells like leaves and memory. I passed the park where I used to push Thomas on the swings, his laughter echoing in my mind. At the store, I bought milk bread, nothing special. But as I reached for my wallet, my hands shook, and the cashier, a young man with kind eyes, noticed. "You okay, ma'am?" he asked. I nodded, but tears welled up unbidden, and I turned away embarrassed. Outside, I sat on a bench, clutching my bag, trying to pull myself together. That's when I heard a voice. Sora Whitaker, is that you?" I looked up to see Margaret, an old friend from the library, days her hair now silver, but her smile as warm as ever. We hadn't spoken in years, not since she'd moved across town. She sat beside me, her eyes searching mine, and before I knew it, I was telling her everything. Thomas, Laura, the house, those awful words. She listened, not interrupting, just holding my hand, her grip steady and sure. And, "Sora," she said when I finished, "you're not done living. Not by a long shot. Don't let them take that from you." Her words were simple, but they landed like a spark in dry grass. For the first time in weeks, I felt something stir inside me, something that wasn't grief or shame. It was small, fragile, but it was there, a flicker of fight, a whisper that maybe I wasn't as finished as they thought. I walked home, the bag of groceries heavier than it should have been. The roses along my fence were still blooming, defiant against the chill. I stood there looking at them, remembering how George had planted them for me, how he'd said they were as stubborn as I was. I didn't know what I'd do next, didn't have a plan. But as I stepped inside the clock ticking in the hall, I felt a shift. This was my house, my life, and I wasn't ready to let it go. Margaret's words stayed with me like a song you can't quite shake. "You're not done living." I turned them over in my mind as I went through the motions of my days, watering the roses, sweeping the porch, making my coffee in that old percolator. But the truth was, I didn't know how to live anymore, not in a world where my own son saw me as a burden, a relic to be packed away. The house, once my sanctuary, felt like a cage, its walls echoing with memories that hurt as much as they comforted. I'd walk past Thomas's old room now, just a storage space for boxes and dust, and feel a pang so sharp it stole my breath. I was 68, not dead, but I was starting to wonder if there was a difference when no one seemed to want you around. I stopped answering the door when Laura came by her knocks, sharp and insistent like she was owed something. She'd leave voicemails, her voice all honey and thorns, saying things like, "Sora, we're just worried about you living alone in that big house." Big house. As if my 2-bedroom home was some sprawling estate. I knew what she really meant. She wanted me out, wanted the deed signed over so she and Thomas could cash in. I'd delete her messages, but they lingered, each one a reminder that I was being erased from my own life. The loneliness was a weight, heavy and constant. I'd always been the one to hold things together. Dinners on the table, bills paid, Thomas's school projects finished. Now with no one to care for, I felt untethered like a boat, cut loose in a storm. I'd sit by the window watching neighbors walk their dogs, kids ride bikes, life moving on without me. I wondered if this was what George felt in his final days when the cancer had whittled him down to bones and whispers. He'd look at me, his eyes still bright, and say, "Sora, don't let the world dim your light." I'd promised him I wouldn't, but I was failing. One afternoon, I found myself in the attic looking for something I don't even remember what. Maybe just a reason to move. The air was thick with dust, the light slanting through a small window, catching motes that danced like tiny ghosts. I opened a box and found a stack of old photos' edges curled from time. There was Thomas at 5, gap-toothed and grinning, holding a fish he'd caught at the lake. There was George, hammer in hand, building the porch swing. And there was me younger, my hair dark and my smile wide, standing in front of the roses the day we moved in. I looked so sure of myself, so full of hope. I sat there cross-legged on the floor and cried not the quiet tears of the past weeks, but deep, wrenching sobs that shook my whole body. I cried for that woman in the photo, for the life she'd built, for the son who'd forgotten her. I don't know how long I sat there, but when I finally stood, my knees aching, I felt different. Not stronger, not yet, but awake. I took one photo, the one of me by the roses, and tucked it into my pocket. Downstairs, I made tea and sat at the kitchen table, the photo propped against the sugar bowl. I looked at that younger Sora, her eyes bright with possibility, and I made a decision. I wasn't going to disappear. Not for Thomas, not for Laura, not for anyone. The next day, I called Margaret. She answered on the first ring, her voice warm like she'd been waiting. Sora, I was just thinking about you. We talked for an hour about nothing and everything, her grandkids, the library, the way the world seemed to move faster now. When I told her about the photos, about how lost I felt, she didn't offer platitudes. She just said, "Come to my book club tomorrow. It's just a few of us old biddies, but it's something." I hesitated. I hadn't been out socially in years, not since George's funeral, but her voice was so steady, so sure that I said yes. The book club was at Margaret's house, a cozy place filled with mismatched furniture and the smell of lavender. There were 5 women all around my age, their faces lined with stories. They welcomed me like I'd always been there, passing me a glass of iced tea and a copy of some novel I hadn't read. I didn't say much, just listened as they talked about the book, about their lives, their losses. One woman, Ruth, spoke about her daughter, who hadn't called in years. You give them everything, she said, her voice soft but steady, and sometimes they just take it and walk away. I knotted my throat tight. For the first time, I didn't feel alone in my pain. After the meeting, Margaret walked me to my car. "You're quiet, Sora, but I see you thinking," she said, her eyes kind but piercing. "Whatever's next, you don't have to do it alone." I drove home, her words settling into me. I didn't have a plan, but I felt a spark, the same one I'd felt on that bench outside the store. It was small, but it was mine. The next morning, I went to the backyard and started weeding around the roses. The ground was hard, the weeds stubborn, but I kept at it. My hands dirty, my back aching. It felt good, like I was reclaiming something. A neighbor, a man named Henry, who'd moved in last year, waved from his porch. He was about my age, with a quiet way about him, always tending his garden. "Looking good, Sora," he called. I smiled, surprised at how easy it felt. "Thanks, Henry," I said, and for a moment I was just a woman tending her roses, not a mother, betrayed, not a widow, forgotten. That evening I sat down with a notebook, something I hadn't done since Thomas was in school, when I'd jot down budgets and grocery lists. I started writing, not sure what I was doing. I wrote about George, about the way he'd hum while he worked. I wrote about Thomas the boy, he'd been the man he'd become. I wrote about the house, about the roses, about the woman in the photo. It wasn't poetry, wasn't even good, but it was honest. And as I wrote, I felt a piece of myself come back like a puzzle piece clicking into place. I started going to Margaret's book club every week. I didn't talk much, but I listened, and slowly I began to share. One day, I told them about Thomas's words, about how they'd cut me deeper than anything. The room went quiet, but not with pity, with understanding. Ruth reached for my hand, her grip warm and strong. "You're still here, Sora," she said. "That's what matters." I nodded, tears in my eyes, but they weren't tears of despair. They were something else, something fiercer. I began to notice things I'd ignored, the way the light hit the roses at dawn, the way Henry's garden was starting to spill over with tomatoes, the way my hands, though wrinkled, were still steady. I wasn't ready to forgive. Thomas wasn't sure I ever would be, but I was starting to see that my life didn't end with his betrayal. I was still Sora Marie Whitaker, and I had something left to give, even if it was just to myself. One day I found an old business card in a kitchen drawer tucked behind some recipes. It belonged to Daniel Thomas's former business partner, a man he'd fallen out with years ago. I remembered Daniel's kindness, how he'd bring me coffee when they worked late, how he'd ask about George with genuine care. Thomas had called him a traitor, said he'd ruined everything, but I'd always wondered if there was more to the story. I held the card, my thumb tracing the faded ink. I didn't know why, but I kept it out, setting it on the table next to the photo of me and the roses. That night, I dreamed of George. He was standing by the roses, his hands in his pockets, smiling like he used to. "Sora," he said, "you're stronger than you know." I woke with tears on my cheeks, but also with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. I didn't know what was coming, but I knew I wasn't going to let Thomas's words define me. Not anymore. The dream of George lingered, his voice echoing in the quiet corners of my mind as I moved through the days. I'd wake early before the sun had fully risen and sit on the porch with my coffee watching the world stir. The roses were still blooming, their petals soft against the crisp autumn air, and I'd touch them gently as if they could carry a message to him. "You're stronger than you know," he'd said, and I wanted to believe it. But the weight of Thomas's betrayal still pressed against me, heavy as a stone. I was trying to find my way back to myself, but it was like walking through fog, every step uncertain, every shape unclear. I kept going to Margaret's book club, and it became a lifeline, a place where I could breathe. The women there, Ruth, Margaret, and the others, didn't expect me to be anything but myself. They didn't see me as a burden or a relic, just Sora with her stories and her silences. One week, Ruth brought a photo of her daughter, a faded picture from years ago, and passed it around. I keep it to remember who she was. She said, her voice steady but laced with grief. I thought of the photo of me by the roses, the one I kept on the kitchen table now, and I understood. We were all holding on to pieces of who we'd been, trying to make sense of who we were now. I started writing more late at night when the house was quiet. The notebook was filling up pages of memories and thoughts, some angry, some tender. I wrote about the day Thomas was born, how his tiny hand curled around my finger, how I'd promised to protect him forever. I wrote about Laura's first visit to the house, how she'd looked at my furniture like it was trash, how I'd smiled through the sting. I wrote about George, about the way he'd dance with me in the kitchen, humming off-key to the radio. The words weren't for anyone else, just me, a way to untangle the knots in my heart. But they were also a reminder that I'd lived a full life, that I wasn't just the woman Thomas had dismissed. One morning, I decided to clean out the garage, something I'd avoided since George's death. It was his space filled with tools and half-finished projects, a place that still smelled faintly of sawdust and oil. I found his old toolbox, the one he'd carried to every job, its red paint, chipped but sturdy. Inside were his hammers, screwdrivers, a level with his initials carved into the wood. I ran my fingers over the tools, remembering his hands, so sure and steady. I didn't plan to keep them out, but I brought the toolbox inside, setting it by the back door. It felt right, like bringing a piece of him back into the house. That afternoon, Henry the neighbor stopped by. He'd seen me hauling boxes from the garage and offered to help. "You don't have to do that alone, Sora," he said, his voice gentle, not pushy. I hesitated. Used to doing things myself, but I let him carry a few boxes to the curb. We didn't talk much, just worked side by side, the rhythm of it comforting. When we finished, he wiped his hands on his jeans and said, "You've got a good place here. It's got heart." I smiled, surprised at how much his words meant. "Thanks, Henry," I said, and for the first time in months, I felt seen not as a mother or a widow, but as a person. Henry started coming by more often, not in a big way, just small gestures, bringing me a tomato from his garden, asking if I needed anything from the store. He'd lost his wife a few years back, and there was a quiet understanding between us, a shared language of loss. One day he noticed the toolbox by the door and asked about it. I told him about George, about the porch swing he'd built, the crib he'd made for Thomas. Henry listened, nodding, his eyes soft. "Sounds like a good man," he said. "He was," I replied, and the words didn't hurt as much as they used to. I kept Daniel's business card on the kitchen table next to the photo and my notebook. I hadn't called him, wasn't sure I would, but it felt important to keep it there like a possibility I wasn't ready to dismiss. I remembered more about him now, how he'd been Thomas's partner in a small construction business, how they'd argued over money or clients or something. Thomas never fully explained. Daniel had always been kind to me, stopping by with a smile, asking about my day. When they split, Thomas painted him as the villain, but I'd never been sure. Looking at the card, I wondered what Daniel was doing now, if he'd remember me. One evening, I went to the library not to work, but to browse something I hadn't done in years. The smell of books, the hush of the place brought back memories of my days behind the desk, helping kids find stories, chatting with regulars. I wandered to the gardening section, thinking of the roses, and pulled out a book on pruning. As I flipped through it, a young woman approached, maybe 20, with a shy smile. "Excuse me," she said, "do you work here?" I laughed, shaking my head. Not anymore, but I used to. "Can I help?" She was looking for a book on perennials, and I walked her to the right shelf, pointing out a few I'd read. She thanked me, her smile bright, and I felt a warmth I hadn't in a long time, like I'd done something that mattered, however small. When I got home, I sat at the table, the gardening book open, Daniel's card still there. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. On impulse, I dialed the number, my heart pounding. It rang 3 times before a voice answered, familiar, but older, warmer. Daniel Carter. I froze, then said, "Daniel, it's Sora Whitaker, Thomas's mother." There was a pause, then a soft chuckle. "Sora, my goodness, it's been years. How are you?" We talked for nearly an hour about nothing at first. His kids, my roses then, about the past. He didn't badmouth Thomas, but I sensed the old wounds, the trust broken. "You were always good to me, Sora," he said before we hung up. I never forgot that. I didn't tell him about Thomas's words about the house, but I felt lighter, like I'd opened a window in a stuffy room. The next day, I went to see a lawyer. It wasn't planned, just something that felt necessary, like weeding the roses or writing in my notebook. The lawyer, a woman named Claire, with a no-nonsense air, listened as I explained my situation. Not the details of Thomas's betrayal, just the house, the deed, my wishes. "I want to make sure it's protected," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. She nodded, pulling out forms, talking about wills and trusts. I didn't make any decisions, but I left with a folder of papers and a sense of control I hadn't felt in months. I started small projects around the house, repainting the porch swing, fixing a loose cabinet door with George's tools. Each task was a reclaiming, a way of saying, "This is mine." Henry helped sometimes, showing me how to use the sander, laughing when I got paint on my nose. Margaret noticed the changes when she came over, her eyes lighting up. "You're waking up Sora," she said, and I smiled because she was right. I was still hurt, still angry, but I was moving, and that was something. One night, I wrote in my notebook, not memories this time, but a question. What do I want? I stared at it, the pen hovering. I wanted peace. I wanted respect. I wanted to be seen not as a mother or a widow, but as Sora with her roses and her strength. I didn't know how to get there, but the question felt like a map, one I was just starting to read. The question I'd written in my notebook, "What do I want?" became a quiet companion, following me through the days like a shadow I didn't mind. I'd catch myself pausing in the middle of small tasks, wiping down the kitchen counter, or tying up the roses, and think about it. Peace, respect, to be seen. They weren't grand wishes, not the kind that needed banners or applause, but they were mine, and they were enough to keep me moving. The fog I'd been walking through was starting to lift, not all at once, but in patches, letting me glimpse a path I hadn't known was there. I kept working on the house small fixes that felt like stitching a torn dress. I sanded the porch swing until it was smooth, painted it a soft green that reminded me of the mint George used to grow. I hung new curtains in the living room, light ones that let the sun spill in, warming the old wood floors. Each change was a choice, a way of saying I was still here, that this house wasn't just a prize for Thomas and Laura to claim. Henry helped when I needed an extra hand, showing me how to tighten a loose railing or laughing when I fumbled with a drill. "You're a natural Sora," he'd say, and I'd roll my eyes. But his words settled into me, building something I hadn't felt in years: pride. Margaret's book club was still my anchor. I started talking more, not just listening. One week we read a novel about a woman who rebuilt her life after loss, and I found myself sharing how I'd been fixing up the house, how it felt like fixing myself. The women nodded, their eyes warm, and Ruth said, "You're not just fixing Sora, you're claiming." That word claiming stuck with me. I wasn't just patching up a house, I was claiming my place in it, my right to exist. I saw Claire the lawyer again. This time I was clearer. I wanted the house protected not just for me, but for whatever came after. We talked about a will, something I'd avoided since George's death. "You need to think about who you want to benefit." Claire said, her pen poised over a notepad. I thought of Thomas, of his words, of Laura's cold eyes. I thought of the photo of me by the roses, the woman I'd been, the woman I was becoming. "I'm not ready to decide yet." I told her, but I left with a draft, a starting point. It felt like a secret one I wasn't ready to share, but one that gave me power. I called Daniel again, not sure why, just following the pull of that business card. We talked longer this time about his life now running a small carpentry shop teaching kids at a community center. He asked about the roses, remembering how I'd tended them when he and Thomas worked together. "You always had a way with growing things," he said, and I smiled, warmed by the memory of someone seeing me, not just as Thomas's mother, but as Sora. I didn't tell him about Thomas's betrayal, but I hinted at changes, at wanting to do something meaningful. "If you ever need a sounding board, Sora, I'm here," he said. I thanked him, my heart lighter, the card still on my table like a promise. One morning, I decided to clear out the guest room, the one Thomas used to call his. It was full of boxes, old clothes, school papers, things I'd kept out of habit. I sorted through them, ruthless in a way I hadn't been before. I found a baseball glove worn from years of catch in the backyard, and for a moment I held it, remembering Thomas's laughter, his small hand in mine. But I set it aside, not with anger, but with clarity. That boy wasn't the man who'd hurt me. I donated most of the boxes, keeping only a few photos, a drawing he'd made at 6. The room felt empty but clean, like a blank page. I started using the room for myself, setting up a small desk by the window. I moved my notebook there, wrote in the mornings with the sun streaming in. I began sketching ideas, not just memories, but plans. Maybe I'd sell some of George's tools, use the money for something new. Maybe I'd start a garden club, teach kids like Daniel did. The ideas were small, but they were mine, and they made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. Henry invited me to a neighborhood potluck, a casual thing in the park. I hesitated, nervous about being around people who might ask about Thomas, but I went bringing a tray of lemon bars. The park was alive with voices, kids running, music playing. I recognized faces from the street people I'd waved to but never really known. They welcomed me, complimented the lemon bars, asked about my roses. I talked, laughed, felt the weight of my loneliness lift, if only for an afternoon. Henry sat beside me, his quiet presence steadying. "You fit right in, Sora," he said, and I smiled, realizing he was right. That night, I sat at my new desk, the window open, the air cool. I opened the draft will Claire had given me, reading it slowly. I thought about Thomas, about the house, about what I owed him. I'd given him everything, my time, my love, my years. but respect went both ways, and he'd broken that. I thought about Daniel, about his kindness, about the community center he ran. An idea flickered small but bright. What if I left something to him, not out of spite, but because he'd built something good? I didn't write it down, not yet, but I let the idea settle like a seed in soft earth. I started walking more, not just to the store, but around the neighborhood, noticing things, the way the trees were turning gold, the way kids drew chalk pictures on the sidewalk. One day I passed a community board with a flyer for a gardening workshop. On impulse, I signed up using my maiden name, Sora Marie, like a nod to the woman in the photo. The workshop was small, just a dozen people, but I loved it, learning about soil pruning, things I'd done by instinct, but never studied. I came home with a packet of seeds, marigolds, and planted them by the roses, a new splash of color. Laura called again, her voice sharper now, less honey. "Sora, we need to talk about the house. It's not safe for you there alone." I let her talk, her words washing over me like rain on a window. When she finished, I said, "I'm fine, Laura. The house is fine." I hung up my hands steady. It wasn't defiance, not exactly, but it was mine a choice to stand my ground. I kept fixing the house, kept writing, kept going to book club. Each step was small, but together they were building something, a life that wasn't defined by Thomas's words. I wore George's old watch now, the one he'd left on the dresser, its leather band soft against my wrist. It ticked softly, a reminder of time moving forward, of my right to claim it. I didn't know where this path would lead, but I was walking it, and that was enough. One evening, I sat on the porch swing, the green paint fresh the air, thick with the scent of roses and marigolds. Henry stopped by, carrying a small pot of basil. "Thought you might like this," he said, setting it on the railing. We talked for a while about nothing much, but it felt like everything. As he left, he said, "You're different, Sora. Stronger." I smiled, the word echoing George's voice in my dream. "I'm trying," I said, and I meant it. The basil Henry gave me sat on my kitchen windowsill, its leaves catching the morning light, a small living thing that asked for nothing but water and care. I'd pinch off a leaf now and then, crushing it between my fingers to release its sharp green scent, and it felt like a promise of growth, of continuity. My days were starting to feel like that too, each one a step away from the shadow of Thomas's words, each one a step towards something I was building, not for him or Laura, but for myself. I was 68, and I was learning slowly that my life wasn't over just because they'd decided I was done. I kept up with the gardening workshop, going every Wednesday to the community center, a low brick building with a patchwork lawn. The group was small, mostly women my age, a few younger, all of us gathered around tables strewn with seed packets and pruning shears. Our teacher, a woman named Lila, with dirt under her nails and a laugh like a bell, taught us about companion planting, how marigolds could protect roses from pests. I thought of my own garden, the marigolds blooming bright beside George's roses, and felt a quiet pride. I wasn't just tending plants, I was tending myself, coaxing something new from soil I'd thought was barren. At home, I kept writing at my desk in the old guest room, the space now fully mine. The notebook was nearly full pages, crowded with memories, questions, plans. I'd started jotting down bigger ideas, maybe selling some of the land, not the house, but the backlot George had bought years ago, a strip of grass we'd never used. It wasn't about the money, though. I knew it could bring a good sum. It was about choice, about doing something bold because I could. I called Claire, the lawyer, and asked about the process. "It's straightforward," she said, "but think carefully about what you want to do with the proceeds." I didn't have an answer yet, but the question felt like a key one I was ready to turn. Daniel called one evening out of the blue, his voice warm through the phone. "Sora." "I was thinking about our talk," he said. "You mentioned wanting to do something meaningful. I've got an idea if you're open." He told me about the community center, how they were trying to expand their programs, woodworking classes, gardening workshops, things to bring people together. "We're short on funds," he said, "but it's the kind of thing I think you'd get." I listened, my heart quickening. I didn't commit, didn't tell him about the land or the will, but I said, "Let me think on it, Daniel." When we hung up, I sat at my desk, the basil scent drifting over, and wrote his idea down, circling it twice. I started spending more time with Henry, not in any romantic way, just as neighbors who'd become friends. He'd bring over vegetables from his garden, zucchinis, peppers, and I'd bake him bread the kind George used to love, crusty and warm. We'd sit on my porch talking about the neighborhood, about the past, about the way time seemed to bend as you got older. One day he told me about his wife, Ellen, how she'd love to paint, how he still kept her easel in the garage. "You don't stop missing them," he said, his voice low, "but you learn to carry it." I nodded, thinking of George, of the watch on my wrist, its steady tick a reminder that I was carrying him too. The book club was still my refuge, a place where I could be raw, unguarded. I told them about Daniel's call about the community center, and Margaret's eyes lit up. "That's you, Sora," she said. "You've always been about growing things, people, plants, doesn't matter." Ruth leaned forward, her voice firm. "Do it. Not for them, for you." Their belief in me was a mirror showing me a woman I was starting to recognize, someone capable, someone worthy. I decided to sell the backlot. Claire handled the paperwork, and within weeks I had an offer more than I'd expected. I didn't tell Thomas, or Laura didn't owe them that. The money went into a separate account, one I hadn't touched yet, but I felt its weight not as a burden, but as possibility. I met with Daniel at the community center, a place buzzing with kids, painting murals, adults learning to build birdhouses. He showed me the space they wanted to expand, a corner lot that could hold a greenhouse, a workshop. This could be something special. "Sora," he said, his eyes bright. I didn't promise anything, but I left with a warmth in my chest, a sense that I was part of something bigger. I kept fixing the house not for resale, but for me. I replaced the kitchen tiles, the chipped blue ones, with new ones, soft gray, smooth under my hands. I hung a mirror in the hall, one I'd found at a flea market, its frame carved with flowers. Each change was a mark, a way of saying, "This is mine." I wore George's watch every day now, its weight familiar, grounding. I planted more marigolds, their gold and orange, a riot of color against the roses. The garden was becoming a tapestry, woven from memory and hope. Laura showed up one afternoon unannounced, her heels clicking on my porch. I let her in, not because I wanted to, but because I was curious, maybe even a little defiant. She sat at the kitchen table, her eyes flicking over the new tiles, the basil, the photo of me by the roses. "Sora, we're worried," she said, her voice tight. "This house is too much for you. Thomas and I think it's time to consider selling." I looked at her, really looked, and saw not a daughter-in-law, but a stranger, someone who'd never known me. "The house is fine, Laura," I said, my voice calm, final. "I'm fine." She left, her face pinched, and I felt a quiet triumph, not loud but deep. I started volunteering at the community center just a few hours a week, helping with the gardening workshop. I taught kids how to plant seeds, how to water without drowning the roots. Their small hands, their eager questions reminded me of Thomas at that age, but I didn't let the memory hurt. I was here now, doing something that mattered. One girl, maybe 10, gave me a drawing of a flower scribbled in crayon. I hung it on my fridge next to the photo, a new piece of my life. I met with Claire again this time to revise the will. I was ready to make decisions. I left the house to myself for now, but I added a bequest for the community center, a sum from the land sale to fund the greenhouse, the workshops. I named Daniel as the executor, not out of spite for Thomas, but because I trusted him, because he'd seen me when I was invisible. I didn't tell anyone, not even Margaret, but signing the papers felt like planting a seed, one that would grow long after I was gone. One evening, I sat on the porch swing, the air cool, the stars sharp above. I thought of Thomas, of the boy he'd been, the man he'd become. I didn't hate him, but I didn't owe him my life anymore. I thought of George, of his voice in my dream, of the roses he'd planted. I thought of the woman I was becoming, not the one in the photo, but someone new, someone whole. I swung gently George's watch, ticking the basil scent, drifting from the open window. I was Sora Marie Whitaker, and I was enough. The days began to feel like a rhythm, not the frantic beat of my younger years, but a steady pulse, like the ticking of George's watch on my wrist. I'd wake with the sun, tend the roses and marigolds right at my desk, then head to the community center or book club. Each task, each moment was a thread in a tapestry. I was weaving one that told the story of a woman who refused to fade. Thomas's words, "You're just waiting to die anyway," still echoed sometimes, late at night when the house was too quiet but they were losing their sting. I wasn't waiting for anything. I was living, and it was a choice I made every day. The community center became a second home. I'd show up with my gardening gloves, ready to teach kids how to prune or plant. But I was learning too from Lila, from the kids, from the way the place hummed with purpose. One afternoon, a boy named Jamal, all of 8, with a grin that could melt ice, handed me a marigold he'd grown its roots, still clinging to a clump of soil. "For you, Miss Sora," he said, shy but proud. I took it home, planted it by the roses, and every time I saw its bright orange petals I thought of him, of the way small acts could root you to the world. I kept in touch with Daniel, not daily, but enough to feel a connection. He'd call to update me on the community center, his voice warm with excitement about the greenhouse plans. "We're naming it after you, Sora, if you'll let us," he said one day, half joking. I laughed, brushing it off, but the idea settled into me a quiet honor I hadn't expected. I told him I'd think about it, but I was already imagining it, a glass-walled space filled with green, a place where kids like Jamal could grow. I didn't tell him about the will, about the bequest I'd set aside, but I felt it like a secret strength, a legacy I was building, not for applause, but for meaning. Henry and I grew closer, our friendship a soft, steady thing. He'd stop by with a basket of tomatoes or a story about his wife's paintings, and I'd share my bread or a memory of George. One evening, he brought over a small wooden box. He'd made its lid carved with a rose. "For your keepsakes," he said, his hands rough but gentle as he handed it to me. I opened it, the wood smooth under my fingers, and felt a lump in my throat. "Henry, this is beautiful," I said, and he shrugged his smile shy. I put the photo of me by the roses inside along with Jamal's drawing and a note I'd written to myself, "You are enough." The box sat on my desk, a reminder of the people who saw me, who cared. I kept working on the house, not big changes now, but small ones that felt like polishing a gem. I repainted the front door a deep blue, the color of the sky just before dusk. I hung wind chimes on the porch, their soft tinkle a song that greeted me each morning. The house wasn't just a structure anymore. It was a reflection of me, of the woman who'd sanded and planted and chosen to stay. I'd walk through it, touching the new tiles, the mirror in the hall, and feel a quiet pride, not loud, but bone deep. Claire called to confirm the land sale was finalized, the money secure in my account. I asked her to update the will making the bequest to the community center official. "You're sure about this?" she asked, her voice neutral, but curious. I'm sure I said, and I was. I didn't need to keep the money for myself. I had enough to live, simply to keep the house, to tend my garden. The bequest wasn't about Thomas, or Laura, wasn't even about Daniel, though I knew he'd steward it well. It was about leaving something behind, something that said, I'd been here, that I'd mattered. Margaret noticed the change in me, her eyes sharp at book club. "You're standing taller, Sora," she said, her smile warm. I laughed, but I knew she was right. I was carrying myself differently, not just in my posture, but in my choices. I shared more at the club now, not just about the house or the garden, but about the will, about the community center. The women listened, their nods and murmurs a chorus of support. Ruth reached for my hand, her grip firm. "You're not just living, Sora. You're shining." I blinked back tears, not of sadness, but of gratitude for them, for this life I was reclaiming. Thomas called one night, his voice clipped, impatient. "Mom, Laura says you're not listening. We need to talk about the house." I let him speak his words, sharp but distant, like a storm on the horizon. When he finished, I said, "The house isn't for sale, Thomas. It's my home." He sighed a sound I knew too well, the one that said I was being difficult. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said, and hung up. I sat there, the phone in my hand, but I didn't cry. I didn't feel small. I felt steady, like the roses that bloom despite the frost. I started wearing my hair differently, pulling it back with a scarf the way I used to when I was younger. I bought a new dress, nothing fancy, just a soft green that made me feel alive. I wore it to the community center, and Lila grinned, saying, "Look at you, Sora, bringing the spring." I laughed, twirling a little, and for a moment I was the woman in the photo, not weighed by years, but lifted by possibility. One morning I found a letter in my mailbox, not from Thomas or Laura, but from the library where I'd worked. They were hosting a volunteer appreciation event and wanted me to attend to be recognized for my years of service. I hadn't thought about the library in ages, but the invitation felt like a nod from the past, a reminder of who I'd been. I went wearing the green dress George's watch on my wrist. The room was full of faces, some familiar, some new, and when they called my name, I stood my heart pounding. They gave me a small plaque, nothing grand, but as I held it, I felt a swell of pride, not just for the years I'd given, but for the woman I was now. That night, I sat on the porch swing, the wind chimes singing the rose box on my lap. I opened it, touching the photo, the drawing, the note. I thought of the will of the greenhouse, of the kids at the center. I thought of Thomas, of the pain he'd caused, but also of the love I'd always have, even if it was quieter now. I thought of George, of his voice in my dream of the roses he'd planted. I closed the box, the wood warm under my fingers, and looked out at the garden, the marigolds glowing in the dusk. I was Sora Marie Whitaker, and I was whole. The morning of the community center's annual fundraiser arrived with a crispness in the air, the kind that makes you feel awake, alive. I'd been helping organize it for weeks, not in a big way, just small tasks, arranging tables, planting marigolds around the entrance, baking trays of lemon bars. But it felt like my event, too, a piece of the life I'd been building. I wore my green dress, George's watch, ticking softly, and pinned a marigold to my scarf, its bright orange, a nod to Jamal's gift. As I drove to the center, the rose box sat on the passenger seat, not because I planned to show it, but because it felt right to have it near, like carrying a piece of my heart. The center was buzzing when I arrived, strung with fairy lights tables covered in checkered cloths, kids running with balloons. Daniel greeted me at the door, his smile wide. "Sora, you've outdone yourself," he said, gesturing to the marigolds. I laughed, brushing it off, but his words warmed me. The event was packed. Neighbors, volunteers, families all gathered to support the center's expansion, the greenhouse I'd quietly funded. No one knew about my bequest, not even Daniel, though I'd told Claire to prepare the paperwork for a public reading if I chose. I wasn't sure I would, but the possibility felt like a card tucked up my sleeve, one I could play if the moment called. I moved through the crowd, pouring iced tea, chatting with Lila about the gardening workshop, laughing with Jamal as he showed me his new seedling. Henry was there too, in a plaid shirt, helping set up chairs. He caught my eye, raising a glass of lemonade and a quiet toast, and I smiled, feeling anchored by his presence. The evening unfolded like a dream music, playing voices overlapping the air, thick with hope. I stood by the marigolds, watching it all, and thought of George, of how he'd love this, a place where people built things together. Then I saw them, Thomas and Laura, stepping through the gate. My heart stuttered, not with fear, but with a strange calm, like the moment before a storm breaks. They hadn't been invited, not by me, but I wasn't surprised. Laura had a nose for events, for places where she could be seen. Thomas looked uncomfortable, his hands in his pockets, while Laura scanned the crowd, her smile sharp. They hadn't come to support the center. They'd come for something else, maybe to corner me about the house, maybe to stake a claim. I straightened, touching the marigold on my scarf, and walked toward them, not because I wanted to, but because I was ready. "Sora Laura," said her voice all false warmth, "we didn't expect to see you here." Thomas said nothing, his eyes flicking to the ground, then to me, then away. "It's a community event," I said, my voice steady. "I'm part of this community." Laura's smile tightened, and she launched into a spiel about how sweet it was that I was keeping busy, how they were still worried about me in that big house. I let her talk her words sliding off me like water. Thomas shifted, muttering, "Mom, can we talk somewhere private?" I looked at him, really looked, and saw not the boy I'd raised, but the man who'd hurt me, who'd chosen greed over love. "Not now, Thomas," I said, my voice calm but firm. "I'm needed here." I turned away, joining Margaret and Ruth, who'd appeared like sentinels, their presence a shield. Laura's eyes narrowed, but she didn't follow. I felt their stares as I moved through the crowd, but I didn't falter. I was Sora Marie Whitaker, and this was my place, my moment. The program began. Daniel taking the stage, a small platform strung with lights. He spoke about the center, its mission, the greenhouse. "We've had a generous donor," he said, his voice warm, "someone who believes in what we're doing." The crowd clapped, and I felt a flush of pride, not for recognition, but for knowing I'd made a difference. Daniel didn't name me, didn't need to. But as he spoke, I caught Thomas's eye across the crowd, his brow furrowed like he was piecing something together. I hadn't planned to speak, but when Daniel called for volunteers to share why the center mattered, I found myself standing, my heart pounding. I walked to the platform, the rose box in my hands, not as a prop, but as a talisman. The crowd hushed. Faces turned toward me, familiar and kind. Henry, Margaret, Ruth, Lila, Jamal. I took a breath, George's watch ticking, and spoke. "My name is Sora Marie Whitaker," I said, my voice clear. "This center has given me a place to belong, a place to grow. But it's more than that. It's a place where we remind each other we're not done, no matter our age, no matter what we've lost." I paused, my eyes finding Thomas Laura beside him, her face unreadable. "I've learned that worth isn't what others give you. It's what you claim for yourself. And I'm claiming mine here with all of you." The crowd clapped some cheering, but I wasn't done. I looked at Thomas, my voice steady. "I've made choices not out of anger, but out of love for this place, for the people who see me. I've rewritten my will, the house, my savings, everything. It's going to the community center to build the greenhouse to keep this going." A murmur rippled through the crowd, and Laura's face went pale, her mouth opening, then closing. Thomas stared, his eyes wide like he'd been struck. I held up the rose box, my hands steady. "This holds what matters to me, a photo, a drawing, a note that says, 'I'm enough.' I don't need a house to prove that. I don't need anyone's permission." I stepped down, the applause loud, but it was the quiet nods from Margaret, Ruth, Henry that anchored me. Daniel met me at the edge of the platform, his eyes shining. "Sora." "I had no idea," he whispered. I smiled, touching his arm. "It's not about me. It's about what lasts." Thomas and Laura approached as the crowd thinned, their faces a mix of shock and anger. "Mom, what the hell was that?" Thomas said, his voice low, shaking. Laura cut in, her words sharp. "You can't do this, Sora. That's our future you're throwing away." I looked at them, not with rage, but with a calm that felt like armor. "You threw it away," I said, my voice soft but unyielding. "When you told me I was just waiting to die, you lost any claim to my choices." I walked away, leaving them standing there, their voices fading into the music. I joined Henry by the marigolds, his hand brushing mine, a quiet support. Margaret hugged me, whispering, "You did good, Sora." I nodded, my throat tight, not with pain, but with release. I'd spoken my truth, not to hurt them, but to free myself. The night ended with laughter, with plans for the greenhouse, with Jamal tugging my sleeve to show me his seedling. I drove home, the rose box beside me, the stars bright above. The glow of the fundraiser lingered in my heart, not as a fleeting spark, but as a steady warmth, like a hearth fire that's been tended through a long night. I drove home under a sky scattered with stars, the rose box resting on the seat beside me, its smooth wood a quiet anchor. I didn't feel victorious in the way you might imagine after standing before a crowd revealing a truth that silenced my son and his wife. Instead, I felt complete, as if the fragments of myself, mother, widow, woman discarded, had woven together into something whole, something mine. Thomas's shocked eyes, Laura's pinched lips, they stayed with me, but they didn't wound. I'd spoken for myself not to punish them, but to claim my place, and that was a freedom I hadn't known I'd been seeking. The days that followed were gentle, like the soft light of dawn creeping over the roses. I moved through them with a rhythm I'd come to trust, waking early to tend the garden. The marigolds and roses, a vibrant testament to persistence. I'd run my hands over their petals, feeling their strength, their stubborn will to bloom despite the chill of autumn. The house, once a weight of memories, felt lighter now, its walls holding not just the past, but the present, my present. The blue door I'd painted, the wind chimes swaying in the breeze, the gray tiles under my feet, they were signatures, marks of a woman who'd chosen to stay to live fully in her own skin. Henry's visits were a steady thread in my days, his quiet presence a gift I hadn't expected. He'd stop by with a handful of peppers from his garden, or a story about his late wife, Ellen, and we'd sit on the porch swing, coffee mugs warming our hands. One morning, he brought a small canvas, one of Ellen's paintings, a field of wildflowers under a vast, open sky. "It belongs here," he said, his voice soft, almost shy. I hung it in the living room, its colors a whisper of life against the walls, and every time I passed it, I felt a pang of gratitude for Henry, for the way he saw me not as a shadow of my losses, but as a woman with a story, still unfolding. The book club remained my sanctuary, a circle of women whose laughter and wisdom held me up. At our next gathering in Margaret's living room, with its mismatched chairs and lavender air, they raised their glasses of iced tea, their eyes bright with pride. "You stood tall," Sora Ruth said, her voice fierce with affection. I smiled, stirring my tea, the ice clinking softly. "I stood for me," I said, and they nodded, their faces a mirror of my own heart. We spoke of the book we were reading, a story of a woman finding her voice, but we also spoke of ourselves, of the ways we'd been overlooked, the ways we'd risen. I left with the library plaque in my bag, its weight a reminder of the years I'd given, the years I was still claiming. Daniel called a few days later, his voice thick with gratitude. "Sora, what you've done for the center, it's going to change everything," he said. I told him about the will, about the bequest for the greenhouse, about naming him executor. There was a long silence, then a quiet, "I'm humbled, Sora." Truly. We talked about the greenhouse, about calling it the Rose Haven, a tribute to George's love to the blooms that had anchored me through grief and betrayal. I didn't need my name carved in stone. I needed the work to endure, to grow where I'd planted it for kids like Jamal to find joy in the dirt. Thomas didn't reach out, didn't knock on my door. Laura sent a single text, sharp and cold. "You're making a mistake, Sora. We can still fix this." I read it, then set the phone down. My hands steady. I didn't hate them, didn't wish them harm. My love for Thomas was still there, deep and unshakable. But it was different now, like a river that's changed course. I'd poured my heart into him, my time, my dreams, but I didn't owe him my future. I'd given enough, and now I was giving to myself, to the people who valued me, to the life I was shaping with every choice. I leaned into the community center, spending more hours there, teaching kids how to plant seeds, how to wait for growth. Their small hands, their eager questions filled a quiet ache I hadn't named. Jamal brought me another marigold, its roots wrapped in a paper towel, and I planted it by the roses, its gold petals a spark of light. Lila, the gardening teacher, pulled me aside one day, her eyes warm. "You're more than a volunteer, Sora. You're a teacher. Lead a class your own." I hesitated, then nodded, a new purpose blooming. I began planning a spring workshop open to all about growing together plants people hope. Claire sent the final will its pages neat my signature a bold arc across the bottom. I read it slowly, tracing the words that gave the house to the center after my time, that set aside the land sale, money for the greenhouse for years of learning. I tucked it into the rose box beside the photo of me by the roses Jamal's drawing the note I'd written, "You are enough." The box was a vault holding not just keepsakes, but the truth of who I was, who I'd become. I closed it, the wood warm under my fingers, and felt a peace that wasn't fragile, but firm like the roots of my roses. I started walking to the park more often, the one where Thomas once chased fireflies, where the potluck had brought me back to the world. The leaves were falling now, carpeting the ground in gold and crimson, and I'd sit on a bench watching kids play, families laugh. One evening, I brought a small stone from the park home, smooth and cool in my hand. I placed it by the roses, not as a monument, but as a marker of my presence, my choice to be here now. That night, I lit a candle, one I'd kept from George's memorial, its flame a steady pulse in the dark. I sat by it, the rose box open, the wildflower painting, glowing on the wall, the marigolds outside catching the moonlight. I thought of the woman I'd been, the one in the photo, her smile wide with promise. I thought of the woman I was now, lined by loss, but lifted by courage, not flawless, but whole. I didn't need Thomas's love to define me, didn't need Laura's respect, didn't need anyone's permission to be Sora Marie Whitaker. I'd carried pain shaped. It turned it into something beautiful, a garden, a greenhouse, a life. I swung gently on the porch swing, George's watch ticking the wind chimes, singing the scent of basil drifting from the kitchen. I was home, not just in this house, but in myself. I want to tell you something, you who's listening may be feeling unseen, may be told your time is done. Your worth isn't in who stays, who praises, who claims you. It's in how you honor yourself, in the quiet moments, the small acts, the choices you make when the world isn't watching. I'm 68 and I'm not finished. I'm planting seeds, teaching children, writing my story. I'm living, not waiting, and as I look at my garden, the roses and marigolds intertwined, I know I'm exactly where I belong.